Hey everybody, welcome back to the second and final portion of our mini lecture series on shaping. This time we're talking about how we can apply shaping. Okay, so let's go through the steps involved in deciding whether shaping is the right solution and how we would implement shaping. So first thing to do is to define the target behavior. This goes all the way back to the first things we discussed in this class with picking a target behavior and defining it using the terms that we've discussed. If you're a little hazy on defining target behaviors, feel free to go back and review what we did early on. Next is to decide if shaping is the preferred procedure. Would something like instructions or modeling or offering prompts be a better way to shape, or not to shape, but to change this behavior? Remember, shaping is labor intensive and slow and relies on the differential reinforcement, so it can be hard to execute. So if there's an easier way to do it than shaping, we should probably pick that. But if it looks like shaping is the right way to go, we next need to identify the starting behavior. So the starting behavior is basically what it sounds like, the behavior that we're going to begin our shaping process with. In the example of training Sniffy to press the bar, our starting behavior was rearing, standing up on the hind legs, which is a thing that rats naturally do all the time, and it's kind of like the thing we wanted the rat to do, which was press the lever. You can imagine starting from something like grooming would be much harder, right? Because it's kind of incompatible with pressing a lever. If the rat's grooming, it's not really attending to other things, but if the rat's rearing up, that's basically half of the standing up to push behavior, right? So starting from rearing is smart, it makes much more sense. It's a lot easier to shape that into a bar press than something that's entirely So things to consider with identifying the starting behavior is one, the person must already exhibit this behavior, right? The behavior that we're going to start with must be something that they already do. We don't want to teach them something new and then shape from there. It's easier if it's something they know how to do already. And ideally, this should be something you can build on to achieve the target behavior. So for example, when teaching someone to walk using crutches for the first time, we might want to start with a behavior that is something they can do and is compatible, right? So something like grasping the crutch in their hands and maybe placing it on the floor, rather than something like that's too advanced, like standing up with the crutches. That's not something they know how to do. They already know how to hold things with their hands, but they don't know how to stand with the crutches. So you want to start with something that they can already do and something that builds toward the target behavior. So we should choose the shaping steps with care as well. Each step needs to be a closer approximation to the target behavior. So we don't want to take steps backwards. Every successive approximation should be closer to the thing that we're trying to accomplish. So in the example of learning to walk with crutches, start with holding the crutches, then start with supporting your weight on the crutches while you're in a chair, and then, maybe start with just standing with some extra support with the crutches, moving successively closer to the goal with each step, making sure that things aren't too big. You don't want step 1 to be hold the crutch and step 2 to be walk across the room with the crutch. That is too big. So we want to use steps that are close enough that the jump from one step to the next is achievable. Too large of a gap will stall progress. Next, we have to choose an appropriate reinforcer. This must function as a reinforcer for the individual. Right, if we want to shape a child's progress on this crutch task, and if we give them a drink of root beer every time they do a little bit of progress, and they don't like root beer, then that's a bad reinforcer, right? We have to pick something that works for them. We also might want to consider the effects of satiation during shaping, right? We don't want something that the subject is going to easily get enough of. So if we give a child food or something each time they get closer to our goal, once the child has had enough of that food, they're not going to cooperate anymore because they no longer desire that reinforcer. This is why conditioned reinforcers can be really, really useful. Something like using a token economy where the more tokens the child has, the more rewards they can purchase later works well because the child is never going to get sated on acquiring tokens they can exchange for a reinforcer. So one, we have to make sure the reinforcer that we're using is actually reinforcing to the individual. And two, we have to make sure that's not something they're going to get sated on quickly. Next, once we get into the actual application, we have to remember to differentially reinforce each successive approximation. No going back, right? We have to move forward. Reinforce the first approximation until it occurs reliably. So the first step towards our goal, we must reinforce reliably. Reinforce until it occurs reliably. holding the crutches well, right? Using the proper grips, handling them correctly, and once that's set, we can move on to the next step. We have to stop reinforcing the first approximation and reinforce the next approximation until it occurs reliably. So to go back to the example of what you've already done using Sniffy the virtual rat, once we've got Sniffy rearing up reliably, and we move on to the next phase of reinforcing Sniffy when he rears near the front of the cage, we want to stop reinforcing him while he's rearing at the back of the cage, right? We want to extinguish that old stage and reinforce the new stage until that next stage becomes reliable. And we continue with that process of differential reinforcement until we've arrived at the target behavior. As I've hinted at earlier, we want to make sure that we are moving at the proper pace. If we move too fast, it will be difficult to progress, right? We want to make sure that we stay on each stage of a behavior until it has become stable and occurs reliably before moving on to the next. If we move too fast, it will be difficult to progress because we're moving too quickly through the stages for them to be learned properly. And if we go too slowly, progress may stall, right? If our subject learns that they're being consistently reinforced at an intermediate stage, they may be reluctant to move on to the subsequent stage because they've, learned that this stage is comfortable. So too fast can make it difficult to move from step to step because it's too big of a leap. And going too slowly can cause progress to stall out. Okay, so here is a table from your textbook showing sort of 10 steps in training someone to use crutches to move around, right? So we might start really small, right? Crutches secured to hands by elastic bandages. Experimenter can stand behind the child. Reinforce is delivered for imitating the bottled response of placing the crutches on the dots marked on the floor, 18 inches in front of and 18 inches to the side of the center line, bisecting the starting point. So you can see everything here is very, very well operationally defined. We have a very precise description of the starting behavior. Crutches secured to hands. We have support for the child from the experimenter. We have dots placed in specific locations on the floor, and we want the crutches to be placed there. So that's our starting point. So for step 2, we have things moving forward a little bit. So completing step 1 and then swinging their body to a crutches supported position with total assistance provided by the experimenter. So having the child swing forward to support themselves, but being supported by the experimenter so they won't fall, and then maintaining that position for 15 seconds before the delivery of a reinforcer. Again, everything is very, very tightly defined, and that's very important. We have, a complete description of the behavior that's required and how long it must be maintained until the reinforcer is delivered. And I'm not going to read this whole list to you, but you can see how things progress. Eventually, the elastic that's securing the crutches to the hands is removed, allowing the participant to do that on their own. The experimenter's actual physical support is gradually faded, so they're using less and less support over time. And again, we move forward each step, asking a little bit more of the participant each time until we are at a comfortable position here at stage 10, where the participant has to complete 12 cycles of placing crutches, maintaining balance, using the crutches with the forearm clamps rather than the underarm supports, until we get to this sort of target behavior here. So I think that this little excerpt from your book does a great job of summarizing everything that we've just talked about. Deciding if this is the right approach, designing a comfortable pace, using differential reinforcement. All these things are critically important to a successful shaping. Okay, that's it for our discussion of shaping. Next time we'll be on to our unit on chaining. See you next time.